and welcome to Badger Talks Quick Fix, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Emma Salzudo from Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. I'm a senior at UW-Madison studying environmental science. I'm pleased to introduce Susan Carpenter, who will speak on gardening with native plants. Native plants are the basis of sustainable, diverse, and beautiful gardens, supporting pollinators, beneficial insects, and wildlife. These gardens thrive without fertilizers, pesticides, mowing, or supplemental watering. She will share garden examples and practical tips for garden care. Susan is the native plant garden curator and gardener at the University of Wisconsin Madison Arboretum. Since 2003, she has worked with students and community volunteers to maintain and monitor a 4-acre garden, representing the plant communities of southern Wisconsin. She also leads a conservation project that involves students and the public in documenting and studying native bumblebees, including the endangered rusty patch bumblebee, Bombus affinis. A graduate student of Stanford University, Susan earned her MS in Botany and MS in Science Education at UW-Madison. Her professional interests include plant ecology, ecological restoration, pollinator conservation, and science education. Please welcome Susan Carpenter.
Thank you, Emma, for the introduction. Today I'm going to be talking about gardening with native plants. And here are a few features and characteristics of native plant gardens and landscapes. So they could be small scale or large scale, depending on what your site allows. These kinds of gardens and landscapes are diverse and healthy. And here by diverse, I mean we have lots and lots of different kinds of plants in the gardens or landscape. And by health, I mean the health in the sense, land health in the sense that Leopold used it. So we have the plants, the animals, soils, the water, the air, all of those elements together compose a healthy garden or landscape. These gardens and landscapes are full of life. So as soon as the plants go in, it doesn't take very long at all for the animals, birds, insects, snakes, etc., to appear and to live in these spaces. Very active with a lot of organisms besides just the plants that you're growing. These are sustainable gardens, so they are perennial plants for the most part, mostly all of them, and so they are seeding and growing by underground stems. Spreading throughout the garden, growing in community with other plants, kind of making space or taking space, as depends on which species we're talking about. There are sustainable gardens. They last for years and years. Of course, they are changing along the way, but they are always present. We don't have to start all over from scratch every year. They're maintained with low inputs. And by this, I mean that we don't do mowing. We don't water the gardens. We don't have to do supplementary watering, except in the case of the establishment phase. We don't use pesticides, herbicides, chemicals, insecticides, fungicides, or anything like that. These are sustainable systems without those. And in fact, in the case of fertilizer, they work better without fertilizer. Native plants thrive without fertilizer. We do have, when I say low inputs, I don't mean no inputs. We will be spending our time and effort and learning in the garden along the way. And these plants are of a place. And by that, I mean that they exist. We are selecting plants that are from our area. So when we look at a garden like this, as it's growing well and gotten established, we can tell from the garden itself and from the composition of plants where we are. I don't use plants here at the Arboretum from northern Wisconsin. I don't use plants from the southeastern US. So these are plants of southern Wisconsin. They've evolved here for thousands of years, and they belong here. And they're adapted to the climate and soils of our area. So they can withstand drought, they can withstand flooding. Now, certain species might not appreciate those extremes, but among all the species, there will be species that can survive and thrive within all the kinds of conditions that we have and all the different soil types that we have here in our area. These gardens are always changing, as I've mentioned. They're dynamic. We see changes over the season. We see changes over years, and we see changes over decades. So these are changes that we embrace and work with. We're gardening with nature in this case. They're fascinating gardens. They're fascinating places to work and learn. And there's always new questions every single day. And there's a growing community interest in these types of gardens and landscapes. And this is interesting in two ways. One is that we're seeing more and more native gardens being installed and being cared for by the community. And it also helps for people who are just getting started or maybe need advice on a tough question, that there are more and more people learning about these gardens, and we can help each other make better progress with our plantings and with our care. So native plants are the basis of food webs. This is so important, not only as food for animals and birds, but also as food for the say insects that are going to become food for say songbirds. So we have complicated food webs involved. We have the seeds of these plants may be food for chipmunks, which may be food for foxes, which may be eating rabbits. So all kinds of different relationships, some of which you'll discover and others of which are there, and maybe we don't even appreciate them fully yet. And these plants provide habitat, structure, habitat, cover, and so forth for a lot of organisms. They hold the soil with their dense root systems, hold soil in place and prevent erosion. And those root systems create small channels in the soil to infiltrate water down into the soil rather than have it run off and cause sediment and nutrient additions to waterways. And they sequester carbon and many other functions. And they support pollinators of all kinds. And this is another area where community interest is very, very high right now. So from anywhere from a tiny little bee that specializes on one type of flower there at the lower left, to this giant, harmless, solitary wasp, who's a good pollinator, but also is collecting a giant katydid in this picture in the center to carry off to provision her eggs. And then large butterflies, day-flying moths, and every beautiful pollinator that. Okay, so now I'm going to shift to talking about some gardening tips for you if you're beginning native plant gardening or if you're enhancing your garden. These will be things that keep in mind as the season goes on, maybe things that you can add into your practices as you're already gardening. And the first one is to maximize the number and diversity of native plants in your landscape. So this means that we want to have as many plants as possible in the landscape. We want to fill it up with native plants, and we want different kinds of native plants. So the picture you're seeing here is a woodland garden in the spring, and you can see there are about 5 different kinds of plants flowering at this time, and they have spread throughout the garden there. We didn't plant every single one of those plants, but we've planted enough that they've been able to spread themselves throughout the area. There's quite a few plants here that have not bloomed yet, so they're still in growth phase, perhaps for blooming later in the season. So maximize the number and diversity of plants in the landscape. And then this is probably the most important piece of advice for any gardener anywhere, but this is to match the plants to the particular site conditions of your site. And it might be even the particular conditions of part of your site. So we need to think about sunshine. Is this full sun? Is it partial shade under trees? Or is it is it sunny for part of the day in full sun and then shady for the rest of the day? Things like that, the amount of sunlight that a particular site is receiving. And then we need to know about the soil type. Is it a soil that's heavy clay, doesn't drain very fast, stays wet for a long time? Or is it well-drained soil, maybe that just where the water flows through, and we need plants that are more adapted to drier areas? We need to know about soil moisture. Is it an area where moisture doesn't really collect, or is it an area where moisture does collect, such as the picture on the right there, which is a large rain garden where water and moisture collect over time. For beauty and interest, and also for pollinator support, we want to include a seasonal sequence of flowering. And for this, we need different kinds of flowers, different shapes of flowers, plants from different families. And so we have at the left there some bees that are visiting a flower that has a very open structure, and the pollen is readily available there right out in the open. And then on the right, we have a strong bee that's able to work with the flower shape and structure of this baptisia flower, and able to access the pollen and nectar on that species. At the bottom, we have a split screen showing this, illustrating this for a single garden. At the left-hand side, we see the garden in midsummer. And on the right-hand side, we see the garden at the end of the season, still with a few things blooming, but completely different species than what was blooming, say, 6 weeks earlier. We want to plant species that are native to your area. And I've talked about this a bit before, but everyone is in a type of eco zone where a certain set of plant species are native. And these would be the plants to select from. And there are some tools and resources available, and I'll give you some link to those later for you to find what's available in your area, what's native to your area. And this idea of soft landings is an important one if you have trees. So we have trees in our flora, like oak, willow, cherry, and birch are some good examples that support a great many different types of insect species. And these caterpillars that are growing in the trees, most of them, they're eating the trees, but most of them are actually going to become bird food, and some of them will be reproducing. And what we do with the soft landing idea is we create the area right under the tree, under that drip line, as a garden bed, basically. So we keep the leaves there. We don't mow it. We don't mulch it. We just keep the leaf litter there. And this provides a place for those caterpillars that are going to survive and reproduce their own cycles to drop down and be safe in that leaf litter, so that they can hatch out and then continue their life cycles. And meanwhile, the other caterpillars that maybe aren't so lucky are becoming bird food and raising up small songbirds and so forth. So these soft landings can be helpful for fireflies, lacewings, beetles, bumblebees, and other insects, as well as the Lepidoptera that are going to benefit from them. When we're planting our plants, if we're planting woodland plants in that area, we want to be a little careful so that we don't damage the root systems of the trees, but it's just hand planting. So you can just watch for those roots and make sure you don't do any damage. We emphasize native plants that will promote pollinators, and we have a lot of resources available for this now for different pollinator groups. I'm using an example here of the rusty patch bumblebee. It's a federally endangered species in the US, and it is a wonderful bumblebee. It is found in the Madison area. It's one of the remaining areas where we can find it here in Wisconsin, or throughout Wisconsin, actually. So there are seasonal lists of plants, and these resources listed at the bottom will be available on your resource link that I'll give you later. So you can use these lists to determine some plants to add to your garden. And these plants will then reflect that seasonal sequence that I mentioned before. And if you think that it's just for rusty patch bumblebees, that's where you'll be happy to learn that it isn't just for rusty patch bumblebees. Any of our 14 bumblebee species that are here in southern Wisconsin would be happy to visit most of these flowers. So it can be and other pollinators will also visit these flowers. So it's a very useful list, even though it was designed or advertised for one species. We need to avoid pesticides. This is very important, especially the systemic insecticides. These are insecticides that are usually applied to the plants when they're in production. So when they're small, soil drench, or even a seed treatment. And these chemicals are in the plant tissue. So obviously they kill any insects that are feeding on the plants, but they also get into the pollen and nectar and can then harm the pollinators as they're collecting pollen for their young and nectar for their own nutrition. So these are to be avoided. Native plant nurseries will not be using these chemicals in production. And then you need to determine from other sources whether or not they've been used, and do avoid them. And don't use them while you're gardening either. Here's where we would like to have a little bit of rough area in the garden. So logs, rocks, leaf litter, kind of buffer areas that look a little bit more wild. And that's where nesting and overwintering might occur for different groups. We'd like to avoid using landscape fabric or rocks for mulch, because those will prevent ground nesting insects from going down into the soil, or for emerging if they're already in there. And instead, we can use plants as mulch. We can just plant more densely, as I referred to in the first slide. So if we fill the area with plants, or even leave a little bit of bare soil for some of those small, tiny ground nesting pollinators. We leave the plant material standing over winter, and then towards spring, we trim the stems, kind of as a stubble. And then those hollow stems are available for stem nesting bees, for example, and the new plant growth just grows right up over them, and they're hidden away. So they're useful, but they're not unattractive. The standing material over the winter has plenty of seeds in it. It's still being used for cover and for structure for animals and insects. We like to create cues to care, and this is a way of showing and signaling that you're caring for a garden, that it's an intentional project. So here we have the lawn coming right up to the edge of the garden, and then there's kind of a real distinct edge there, and then the plants growing within the garden. You can tell from this picture that this is not an accident. We're not just letting it go. We're actually gardening on the left there, and it's an intentional but cared for garden. It's really good to include small interpretive signs. You can either make your own to highlight a project or a plant or an area that you're working on, but you can also get them commercially. Here's a pollinator habitat sign, or the traditional signs in the garden here at the Arboretum have a lot more information on them. But even a small sign is helpful to convey to people as they're looking at your garden, what are you up to? And then I really encourage you to find ways to record and share what you're doing. Some of this is just records for yourself over time. It's easy to forget what has happened in the garden, what's happened over time, when you did different plantings, or when you observe different things. So it's great to have a record, sometimes a video record, photography record. Other people like to use art or writing, poetry to capture some of the changes in the garden. And then this gives you a way to not only keep your own records, but to share them more broadly. And here are some projects that you can contribute to if you have records. So Bumblebee Brigade is a DNR project for people to send in bumblebee observations. We have iNaturalists, of course, eBird if you're a birder, and Journey North tracks migration of monarchs and hummingbirds. And then finally, it's really important to inspire other people. So inspire youth and your community. There might be a place there where the community members would come together and put together a planting, a project that would be shared with the community, but also be a place for neighbors to come together to contribute to a good project as a group. And then one really great entry point, if you have your own garden or one of these community type plantings, is to harvest and share seeds, because that just brings us into what the plants are, what they look like when they're blooming, what the seeds look like, how to grow the seeds, what the seedlings look like, where to grow them, and it gives a source of seeds for others. So this is one really great entry point for community gardening, or for individuals to kind of help spread the word. So as you create new native plant gardens or enhance existing ones that you're working on, I hope that you have a great season and happy spring. This is the short link here with resources for you. If you follow that link, you'll have a set of resources to help you with your gardens this season. Thank you.